Okay, I think I'm recording, but I actually cannot tell while I am in sharing mode. So I'm going to go out of sharing mode for a moment. Yes, we are recording. Okay, hi. As you might have guessed from this video being placed under the surveys week module and the slide you just saw, this is going to be a short video about surveys. Let me go back to my screen share here. Okay. So I want to give you some of the highlights, as I promised before, about this method, should you want to use it in your proposal write-up. I'm just going to go over the things that you really need to know about if you want to name this as a method in your grant proposal. There is a lot more in this presentation and in this week's module. There are whole courses on survey design. So it's a big, big area, as you might guess. This PowerPoint is 46 slides long, which is admittedly pretty ridiculous. So there's a lot here for you to dig into if surveys are something you're really interested in or really passionate about knowing more about. But if you are just trying to get the basics for your grant proposal, that's what we're going to cover here just to keep this a little more manageable. And let me just say, it is very weird to teach into a computer screen with no actual people around me. So yeah, this is a fun experiment. I hope it ends up being useful to somebody. So before we jump into some of these slides here, let's go over to Canvas and take a look at some of the resources that you have here. So this was back week 11, end of March. We had a lecture on surveys, which will be the PowerPoint I'm about to go over. This is a sample size calculator, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And then the rest of this stuff is some resources on the web that actually cover a lot of what is in the rest of that PowerPoint that I'm not going to cover. You don't actually have to write any survey questions. You don't have to develop the whole instrument for your grant proposal, even if you are choosing this method. So I would say, take a look just so you can get a feel for what a survey is like, what it's all about, and how to think about designing it, so that you're getting some of the content of the course that you originally signed up for. But this is sort of just some optional extra information for you. And it's probably a little bit more engaging to look at these two than just at the text on the PowerPoint. So I would go to these if you want to know about survey questions. The last thing here is just an optional. This is the activity that we normally would have done in class. I'll just open it up here so you can see a preview. So this sort of gives you a set of different possible research questions, and it sort of tells you the things that you want to cover in your survey. And so this normally is done in groups, and people get a chance to practice crafting survey questions that would get at these particular things. And then they also get a chance to try having another group do their survey so that you can see, okay, did the questions actually work? Did they get me the information that I was trying to get? That can be a really, really tricky thing with surveys, is designing them in such a way that you actually get the information that you were trying to get. And a lot of times you don't know if you've done a good job of that until you test out the survey on a group, which is called doing a pilot. So obviously we can't do this in class, but again, if folks are interested in going more in depth and really trying to get a handle on using this method, then you can run through these exercises on your own. We can also do them in one of the Tuesday drop-in sessions or schedule office hours at any time for anything you want to get more in depth with. So let's go back to modules. And we already have a PowerPoint open here. So I'm just going to go through slides 1 through 7. I'll touch on slide 13 and slides 41 to 47 for now. So hopefully we'll keep this kind of short. Okay, so Let's go full screen. A survey is a research technique that's used to gather information from a sample of respondents by employing a questionnaire. This essentially means, all of you have probably done surveys. Hopefully you're filling out your census. That is a type of survey. And so you received a questionnaire in the mail in that case, right? And you may have gotten a code to go online and fill it out. One thing that you may or may not know is that historically the census is done by people going door to door. The government hires people all over the country in different neighborhoods to actually go door to door and administer the surveys and read the questions out. That is because you get a much higher response rate and a much more accurate response rate if you can have a face-to-face administration of the questionnaire. So we're going to cover the different ways that you could deliver a questionnaire and collect the data as kind of the core of what this presentation is going to be about. So questionnaires are also designed based on response style. And what that means is that you've probably seen on surveys before, your teacher course evaluations that you do at the end of every semester is another great example that has multiple kinds of response styles. So you have multiple choice, you have yes/no questions on there, and you also have open-ended questions where you get a chance to just leave whatever comments you want to leave, right? So there's different kinds of ways that questions can be designed to get the information that you want. The whole purpose of the questionnaire format and what makes it totally different from, say, an interview or some of the other methods that we're talking about in this class is that it's really good for getting information from a very large population. It's really good for getting information that's very standardized across that sample of your population so that you can analyze it quantitatively, and meaning that you can gather statistics that say, I'm sure that, this is true for this population, right? With other kinds of methods like interviews, we can't make really strong claims like that because usually you can't involve a large population because it's too time consuming. So the questionnaire is a way to standardize how you collect information so that you can standardize how it's analyzed. But before you even begin to think about how you're going to design your questionnaire, aka your survey questions, you have to think about who, right? Because it's not going to be useful if you don't get the right sample of the population. It's going to make your results have to go totally out the window if you didn't have enough people, or if you didn't have enough, if it wasn't representative of the population that you're interested in. So what is a sample? You can see from the graphic, it's just a subset of a population. And the whole reason we do it is so that we can make generalizations about that population, which is why it's so important that our sample be big enough and that it be representative. And of course, the reason that we take a smaller sample is that usually you're not going to have the resources to talk to everybody in the population. So for example, you are interested in housing of UK college students. Okay, there are 30,000 plus students at UK. You're not going to be able to survey all 30,000 of them. That would be kind of ridiculous, and it would be a huge waste of resources and time because you don't need to. In fact, as long as you've done the math right, you may find that you only need to talk to a few hundred of those folks. And guess what? The data that you get from talking to, say 800 people at UK is going to be just as reliable as if you had talked to all 30,000. How can that be? Well, that can be because there are statistical wizards out there who can calculate the exact sample size. For our purposes, we use a sample size calculator, okay? And this is going to tell you the minimum number of people that you need in order to be confident in your results. So the website that I have linked under your module and that we're looking at right now is from Qualtrics. Qualtrics is the software that the University of Kentucky actually uses for pretty much all of its survey work. All of us as students and faculty, we have a Qualtrics account already, and you can look up how to access that account. And so you have a ready-made way to develop surveys, deliver them on the web, analyze results. And we also have a sample size calculator. So again, if we're interested in the entire UK student population, I'm going to put in 30,000, which is just an estimate. I'm not going to look up the actual number. Okay, look, my ideal sample size is 380 students. Isn't that something? And that is going to give me 95% confidence with a 5% margin of error, which, just to remind you, we talked about this in the beginning of the term, but what that means is that I could be that, for example, if I asked this sample of 380 students how satisfied they are with their living situations, I could be and say I found in that sample that the majority were very satisfied, then I could say I'm 95% sure that if I asked all 30,000 students, they would say that they are very satisfied. And most likely what I would have done when I collected that data is actually assign a numerical value to that. And so that they would be within 5% either way of that numerical value. So it is explained in a little bit more detail on this blog too. If you just want a reminder, you can look through and see, what does confidence interval mean? What does confidence level mean, right? And remember, the interval is the margin of error. The level is just how confident you are. And you may be thinking, okay, well, how do I pick what confidence level and what margin of error? It really just has to do with the amount of resources you have. Typically, you want to be at least 95% confident. That's what we normally do in the social sciences, and we usually have a margin error of 5%. That's pretty standard. But remember, as your sample size gets smaller, you get more error, right? So if I was willing to accept more error or less confidence in my work, then I would see that the recommended sample size would decrease. And that can be helpful if you don't have a lot of money or a lot of time. If it's going to be impossible for you to get to 380, then you could, go down to 90%. You're pretty much never going to go below 90% because at that point it's kind of worthless. But as you can see, my sample size has now gone down by more than 100 to 269. So that's just an option to keep in mind. So let's go back. So that's one of the things that I will expect you to include in your grant proposal. If you talk about using survey as a method, I want you to talk about how many people are you going to survey, how did you get to that number, how confident are you going to be, and also how are you going to select them. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. A lot of times it's just going to be done randomly. So suppose you're going to do 380 surveys to reflect the UK population. you could just get a list of all 30,000 student IDs. And you could have a computer program just randomly pick 380 from that list, and those are going to be your 380 that you're going to survey. That is just a simple random selection, and that's very common. But a lot of times you want to be more specific than that. So some of the other ways that you can sample, generally it's often falls under this banner of non-probability sampling. All that means is that it's just not based on a random probability calculation. So convenience is one. This is that situation where you're like, okay, there's no reason that I can't just survey everyone who's in my dorm. I have an opportunity and I'm around them, and so that's how I'm going to do it, because it's convenient. You'll need to have a good reason that you'll need to show that convenience is not going to interfere with the quality of your data. Because a lot of times if you do things by convenience, it's not going to be representative of the whole population, and that's going to lead to problems. And so that's the sort of thing, to think about when you are reading scholarly articles and they talk about their methods and how they did things. A lot of times that's kind of how we evaluate the quality of things. And a lot of times funders won't fund things if it's not explained. If you're going to do something for convenience and you don't say how that is going to be acceptable for your particular research question. Okay, next is the quota. So this can be important so that you make sure, for example, that you get equal amounts of men and women in your sample. Maybe you want to make sure that you include a representative amount of people who are first generation college students. Right, so you could specifically identify all the first generation college students, and then again, go and see how many you would need using the sample calculator in order to get a representative quota, right? And then you would have to actively recruit, right? So it's not just random, you are actually going out and seeking people who are first generation college students and inviting them to be in your survey, so that you fill that quota so that it is representative. And then lastly is a word that I really struggle with saying. I don't know why they call it purposive and not just now I can't say that, purposeful. But this is really when you're only interested in a specific sample of the population to begin with. You're not interested in the whole, body of 30,000 UK college students. Maybe you're only interested in first generation college students. And so you don't bother with, trying to sample for anybody else. Maybe you are not interested in university students at all. You want to survey senior administrators. So that is where, you're only sending your survey to the people who are senior administrators. Whatever you choose is fine. You just need to have a rationale as to why it makes sense for the specific question you're asking. So again, when you do your write-up, make sure that you are including what your sampling strategy is, and how many people you expect to survey. And again, all of this only applies if you're using survey in your method. So I'm going to jump down. I think I also said I wanted to have us take a look at slide number 13. Excuse me. It's going to be slide 14. I just wanted to, here we go. So sorry. Slide 12. I made some changes to this PowerPoint after I wrote down what slides I was going to cover. So we are on slide 12. And I just wanted to talk briefly about different approaches to collecting the data. I've already sort of mentioned this, but these are just the different ways that you could potentially administer your questionnaire. Self-administered can be really common. They all have all of these different types of um, administration have their advantages and disadvantages. And if you go on to the additional slides, you'll see that I cover each one of these approaches in detail. So again, if you want more information, because this is something you also would need to include in your proposal, is which mode of delivery are you going to use for your questionnaire and why. So do take a look at those more detailed slides, but I'll just quickly run through them and say, self-administered surveys, that's basically like if you get a survey in the mail and you're supposed to mail it back. These have the lowest response rates. I was so excited to receive a Nielsen survey several months ago, because when I was a kid, I always wanted to be included in the Nielsen survey. If you are wondering what that is, it has to do with the TV ratings on what you watch on television. It's so nerdy. But I have not filled that out despite how excited I was to get it. And I think I've thrown it away finally because it was sitting on my table for months. And that's kind of the big issue with self-administered surveys. You really have to send out a lot of them. So, again, if you need 380 people to respond, then it's going to be, you probably have to mail out 1,000 in order to get that many back. So you have to always think about the response rate with these different methods. The other problem with self-administered surveys, say, you don't even have to worry about the mail. Say you're going to pass them out in your dorm. And maybe you're going to sit at a table out in Young Library, and people are going to fill out the survey right there and hand it right back to you. Okay, well, that's fine. But if you have a lot of people coming and doing the survey at once, you can't really help them. If people are doing it at home and they have questions about a question you're asking, you don't get the chance to walk them through any issues with the questions. And so you can end up with errors because there's misinterpretation and things like that. The other thing that you don't get with self-administered surveys that you get with some of the other options are a chance for you to have some interpretation. You don't get to consider the person's tone of voice or emotional expression, which can all aid in how you interpret information. That said, self-administered surveys and computer-assisted surveys or internet surveys essentially are by far the most common, and they're perfectly fine and effective ways to gather most kinds of data. And the reason that those are the most common is because they're cheap. Like I said, we already have Qualtrics, which can give you, is a really simple tool to make a survey in, and you get a link and you just send it out and people can go and do it on their own. And then the software is like already has it analyzed and ready to go for you. So that's really nice. So yeah, cheap and easy, but maybe you don't get as good of response rates or as much interaction with your research subject. And as you might imagine on the flip side, face-to-face interviews and telephone surveys have the highest response rates. Face-to-face is the absolute best. That's ideal, but again, it's expensive. You have to have enough people to go door to door and enough time to like go and talk to everybody you want to survey. If you're going to be doing 300 or 400 surveys, that's a lot. And for most community-based research, it's just not feasible. I will say in community settings though, doing research on a face-to-face basis is really important for making that research meaningful within the community context and not just something that you're going and extracting for your own purposes. So that's something to also keep in mind. And oftentimes with community problems, we do work on a little bit of a smaller scale. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about those. Obviously, email, pretty straightforward. You can email a survey to somebody and have them send it back to you. But if you're already using the internet, why not go ahead and put it on the web? One last thing that I didn't mention about self-administered surveys, and oftentimes surveys that are administered on the web, that you do have to keep in mind, they're not appropriate for all audiences. So children, people who have reading disabilities or who have visual impairment, you're locking out what could be an important part of your population with those methods. And so sometimes you can combine these methods also, if you want to do the majority of your population as a web-based survey, but then do telephone follow-ups for folks who maybe didn't respond or couldn't fill it out that way. But one thing you do have to keep in mind is that will influence your response. That will add response bias, because there will be differences in the way that people respond based on the mode of delivery, oftentimes. Okay. Let's go up to slide 41. Which again is, I'm realizing my numbers are going to be off here. I think slide 40, yes. Okay. So some of the things you need to think about if you are going to use survey as a method is that you're going to have a lot of time to prepare the questions and to test them out. As I mentioned before, you oftentimes don't know if your questions are effective or if you've got problems with them until you try them out. You want to be really clear with why you are doing the survey. Not for yourself and your grant proposal, but actually in the survey itself. If you're giving someone a questionnaire, they're going to want to know, why should I do this, right? What's the point? And provide some additional instructions. Sometimes it may not be obvious to them what they need to complete the questionnaire. Thinking about student housing and finances and cost of living, you might need people to answer questions about their monthly expenses and their budgets, and so they might need to actually have some information handy in order to answer the questions you want to ask. And then consider the length of the survey. This is a big one. You may have a lot of things you really want to know about, but people get fatigued, and once you start getting into 4+ page surveys, people are just not going to be interested. And especially with these web-based surveys, usually it tells, they will get an indicator of how long the survey is. And so they may not even start it if they see, okay, this is going to take 45 minutes or there's 75 questions. People are not going to want to respond to that. Qualtrics, the software that UK has that I mentioned, it actually does, it calculates intuitively how long the survey will take somebody to complete, and it tells them that when they first access the survey. So keep that in mind. So the best questionnaires, the best surveys are really highly structured so that the data can be analyzed quantitatively and systematically. And so doing that correctly is really essential to making sure that you get valid responses. Because if you're asking one thing, but the person thinks you're asking a different thing, or you don't provide all the relevant options, suppose you're doing multiple choice and you leave things out that are kind of a big deal, then you're gonna have worthless data. And so we spend a lot of time giving thought to the questions we ask, how we ask the questions, right? How they're framed, what language we use, and the order that we ask the questions. That's something that is not always obvious, but it's really important, for example, to start with easy general questions, demographic questions, and then move on as you go through the survey to those more specific questions, more questions that people may need to think about a little bit more. And you can also structure it in such a way that the questions build on one another, so that people have already kind of got their gears turning, thinking about the kinds of things you want them thinking about as they go on and answer the questions. So for example, if I ask somebody as the very first question on a survey, on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with your living conditions? And then the rest of the survey asks specific questions about their living conditions and how much money they spend. It has a big effect that I ask that question, how satisfied are you, before I ask all these other questions that might have got them thinking about some of the issues that could really inform how they think about how satisfied they are. So remember, each of the responses to these questions doesn't exist just as an objective fact on its own. It has a context, and the context affects how people answer. And so you want to think about that when you go to design your survey. Now, as I mentioned before, you can have open-ended questions on a survey. This is where, maybe you don't have the resources to do full-on interviews, but you have some things you want to know about that just can't be captured in a multiple choice or a rating question. You want to give people a chance to say things in their own words. Normally, you are not going to have very many open-ended questions on a questionnaire unless you have somehow a lot of resources to do something and analyze it. Because again, what's the point of asking 400 people, 10 questions that they just write paragraphs in their own words? You can't really standardize that. You can't say anything about the general population based on that because it's so individualized. So usually you're using a very systematic, structured format for your survey questionnaire, but you may ask a couple questions at the end just to get a little bit more in depth. Maybe you would want to have quotes that you could pull out when you go to write up your research. There can be various reasons for doing that. So when you think about your teacher course evaluations, you have comments at the end. And those are the most helpful part for the instructors who are more interested in their individual feedback than we are interested in just knowing generally how we rank compared to the rest of the university, right? Only the administrators are interested in the rest of the survey. So when would you use this method, right? When to use a survey? It's a cost and time efficient way of collecting a lot of data from large populations. It's less pressure on the respondent to respond quickly or in a certain way. So it's a little bit less intimidating than being in an interview, for example, or being in a photo voice or a focus group kind of situation. And it's really easy to analyze and record the data. It's very straightforward. So if those are the kinds of things you're looking for in a method, and if you want to make generalizations about a bigger population, which is really the big thing, if you want to say all students, across the board have this problem, then a survey questionnaire might be the way to go for you. However, there can always be bias, and you don't always know what the sources of bias are as well as you do with other types of research. So for one thing, you could have made an error in your sampling, which is just, you know, we all make mistakes, something we missed, something we just, we weren't able to get enough people to participate, or we forgot to make it representative based on ethnicity or gender. And, you know, those are things that can affect people's answers too in ways that we don't expect. Maybe you think ethnicity doesn't matter when it comes to housing justice for students, but there's a good chance you probably see differences across different ethnic groups. Or, you know, maybe differences across gender. So there could be sampling error. There could be response bias. So sometimes people don't answer questions honestly. Maybe they're not even really aware themselves that they, you know, they answer according to what they would like to believe, right? So, you know, if you had a question like, are you able to make ends meet every month after you've paid for all your cost of living? And people might say, yes, you know, I do great. But really, their bank account's overdrawn, they're taking payday loans, they're, you know, doing all sorts of things to make ends meet that they're not thinking about, because most of us like to think that we're doing okay, right? Another issue that introduces bias that might surprise you is that people who are willing to take your survey, they may be really fired up about housing issues. So they answer differently than the people who saw your survey request to talk about housing issues and weren't very interested because they don't care and they're happy with their situation. And so, you know, maybe your answers only reflect the people who bothered to respond because they have the issue. And then lastly, wording of the question, there just can be misunderstandings. So these are all things that introduce errors into your questionnaire. And so I have a little case study here. I've mentioned the teacher course evaluations a couple of times. This is a list of articles that that show that teacher course evaluations are incredibly unreliable and incredibly biased, especially when it comes to gender and race. They're incredibly biased and problematic, and most of the scientific literature actually says we should not use them at all. We certainly shouldn't use them as a way to evaluate whether or not somebody is effective at being a college instructor. And unfortunately, they are used a lot of times to decide whether or not people get hired into a new job, whether or not they are allowed to stay in their current job. So I myself, I'm a year-to-year contract, and every year I have to be reviewed, not just on these evaluations, but it's a big part of it. And then they decide whether or not to renew my contract. It's also used to see if people should be promoted. But there are all sorts of bias and errors with them that some people feel can't be eliminated. And this kind of gets into a chapter that we read earlier in the semester. Hopefully you had a chance to read it. It's just the beginning of this book, Damned Lies and Statistics. And it's really great. It gives us a lot more context for how statistics are gathered and all the different ways they can be used. A lot of times we put a lot of faith into statistics and numbers because they sound factual, because they're math, but there's always politics behind how numbers are gathered, why they're gathered, and a lot of times that's not obvious. And it makes them a great tool for manipulation. Again, statistics are great, and survey data is great because we can summarize a lot of information and we can inform our policies. But you know, the whole history of statistics of gathering information about populations, it was born as a discipline, as a way to influence debates over social issues. And that's primarily how it's used today, if you think about it. And I'm sure many of you with the coronavirus pandemic are experiencing yourselves a lot of frustration about which numbers do I believe and where are they coming from. And, you know, there are several maps I've seen going around that show, you know, where people are traveling and where they're being good at staying home like they're supposed to, or like as being advised. And the map is based on people's cell phone data. But guess what? The map doesn't account for the fact that a lot of the data that's being picked up is on freeways, right? Freeways that cut through rural areas. And so it looks like people are moving around in rural areas, and it becomes sort of a way to stigmatize rural people. So you have to break down county by county and think about what else is there. And then you have to think about, well, why did somebody make this map? And I want to clarify, I'm not talking about the New York Times map that was recently published. I'm also going around, which is a little bit better because they do that county analysis and they do account for per capita and all that. But, you know, who's using the freeways? It's not rural people a lot of times. It's people who are in the adjacent cities who are traveling through these rural areas. So yeah, we always have to think about where the numbers come from. And when you're writing your proposal, you need to go ahead and be explicit about how you're going to gather the information. And you need to be upfront about the problems and the biases that you might run into. So you have to really think hard about it. A lot of times we like to, you know, bias is such a dirty word in our society. You know, you never want to be biased. We've always got to be objective. It's not really possible. You know, if there's one thing we've learned from social science, is that everybody has bias. Everybody is informed from their own cultural context, their own position in life. And so the word we use for that in social science is positionality. It's a really straightforward word, which just means thinking about where you come from. You know, if I were to design this questionnaire about student issues, I am in a totally different kind of living experience than most students. And so I wouldn't design a very good questionnaire for students, most likely. I would probably have a lot of biases. And I should acknowledge that if I'm writing a grant proposal. It doesn't make it look weak. It makes you look strong and smart and careful, that you're thinking about it and you're trying to mitigate your bias as best you can. So I might, you know, say, if I were the one writing this grant proposal, I want to better understand students' perspectives on these housing issues. But I have bias and lack of firsthand knowledge, so I'm going to consult with a team of students who are going to inform the way that I develop this, this questionnaire, and who are going to help contribute the questions and design it. And that's going to help eliminate some of the bias that I might introduce from my positionality. That also becomes a way to make it more community engaged. And that's an argument that you can make in your proposal about why it's, you know, really important that this is a student-led project or proposal, because you're a part of the community you want to do the work in. And that's going to be a big plus for a lot of funders because it makes your data more reliable. Okay, I think that is all that I have on this. So as I mentioned, if you do want to get more in depth with how to design survey questions, you can go and look at some of these other resources. Common survey mistakes, Survey Questions 101, tips for writing questionnaires, all have some great content about the different kinds of questions and how to write them. And you also may have a couple of quiz questions for quiz number 3 that ask you some things about survey questions. So you may have to go and dig through that PowerPoint a little bit more. I would use your find function. So going back here, you can, I'm using a OpenOffice application, but usually if you go into edit, I think this is true on Microsoft products too, you can click find and, you know, maybe I have a question on the quiz about open-ended survey questions. So I'm just gonna search for open-ended here and look. It's gonna find all the instances where I use that word. So that can be a good way to quickly find information as you're going through the quizzes. You can also use Control F on your keyboard to pull up the find in most applications. Okay, well, that is it. Thanks, guys.